Good afternoon. Welcome back to our Civil Human Bible Study. I'm Rev Dave Thompson, and I'm a civil human minister, and what that means is that I focus my ministry on building human peace and common ground. So in that effort, I'm looking at my own spiritual heritage, and that's these scriptures, the Bible, the Christian Bible, to try to find those teachings that I feel as a human being are relatable and applicable to everybody across the board, regardless of our different faiths, regardless of our different politics and our different lifestyle. So I would love if you would join me by reading in this passage. This morning we're in Matthew chapter 21, starting in 23 verses 23 through 27. Let's go ahead and start with verse 23. Now when he came into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people confronted him as he were teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" But Jesus answered and said to them, "I also will ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I likewise will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, where was it from? From heaven or from man?" For they reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, when then did you not believe him? But if we say from men, we fear the multitude, for all count John as prophet." So they answered Jesus and said, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Thanks for being patient with me as I read through that passage. Taking me a little bit more time this morning. So what's going on here? This is the great entry of Jesus. In this count at this time right now, we're talking about Jesus entering Jerusalem for the first time really in his official ministry. Jerusalem is the capital city of Israel and is the hot seat of all of their political, their social, and their religious culture and society. The temple, which is there, is a place where Israelites travel from all around the nation, and really those who are all over the world will come specifically on this day, which is Passover, which is a very special holiday for Jewish people each year. And so they come to this temple in order to offer sacrifices and offerings and to deal with situations that they've got to deal with. It's also sort of the courtroom of the area. It's where all the legal things happen as well. It's where their Supreme Court would be, for lack of a better term. So it's a very important place. And it's a place that a lot of people back then in the Kingdom of Israel would have made an announcement really about who they were. You know, we forget sometimes, or maybe don't know, that there were other people besides Jesus who had followers and who in fact were crucified and who were trying to make a statement. Jesus was one in particular that stood out among those because he had an air about him that was attractive to the poor and to the common person. He arrives in Jerusalem not on a horse or camel and brass playing and drums beating. He comes merely on a donkey, which is the sort of working class animal and the animal that poor people could really afford. He doesn't have the band playing in front of him, which often would happen. They blow ram's horns if they were, a political candidate, if you will, and they would ride in and make a whole bunch of noise. No, in fact, the people who were making noise were the people welcoming Jesus and saying to him, "Please save us," throwing their cloaks and their branches on the ground, because Jesus had made a name for himself as being somebody who will actually stick up for the poor. I love that about Jesus, especially. I really wish we had some of that today. So let's talk through this particular experience, and I'd like to unravel what's going on here. So Jesus is coming back into Jerusalem. He took a break for a night to go lodge and to be out from the crowds. So he's coming back. He's at the temple now and teaching people, which is a common thing for people to do, especially rabbis or teachers, to go to the temple to teach. People would come in and listen to all these different lecturers. So there are a bunch of people listening to Jesus. And no surprise, the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they come up to him and they say, look, why are you here, first of all? Second of all, who gave you authority to do what you're doing? And what makes you think that you can? And then that's basically where they leave Jesus. So Jesus does a really great thing here. Instead of answering their question, he answers it with another question. We talked about John the Baptist in the past. Jesus was a big fan of his early on in the account that Matthew gives us here in these scriptures. He talks about John the Baptist. In fact, this is the guy that Jesus went to start his ministry, to be baptized, and to kind of officially acknowledge that he was stepping into ministry. So John the Baptist was a key figure in this nation because he was living out in the wilderness, eating locusts and honey. Locusts are grasshoppers. He wore a camel hair draped cloak with like a leather belt around him. So he was trying to show that you don't need all of this big hoopla. You don't need all of these beautiful clothes. You don't need the beautiful temple. You can experience God and make a change in your life wherever you are. And he was doing that in the wilderness, in the desert. So Jesus sort of takes that ministry concept and takes it with him. And so he goes to the Pharisees and said, if you can answer this question for me, I will tell you what authority I use to do what I'm doing. Whose authority was John the Baptist? So the Pharisees know that this is a trick question as well, because they know if they say that John the Baptist had authority by God, meaning he didn't need authority from the Pharisees, but had authority directly from God. If they said that, then Jesus can simply say, why didn't you follow him or listen to what he had to say? On the other hand, if they say, no, his authority came by his own ethics, by mankind or humankind. In other words, he didn't really have any authority to do that. If they said that, all the people that are around him would have freaked out, because John the Baptist was loved by the people. People absolutely adored him because he was the opposite of the religious leaders of the day. And so now said Jesus, because the Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leaders, won't say anything, Jesus says, well, neither will I say anything to you. There's an important lesson in this. We are 2,000 years removed, right? You and I. It's a Friday afternoon. I'm sitting here in California, Sacramento, in the United States of America. It is 2020, and boy, has it been a year. How in the world does this story have any application to me just as a human being? As a human being, not as a Christian, not as a spiritual person, just as a human being. What can I pull from this to apply to my life here and now? A lot. The fact is, the religious leaders of Jesus' day have a lot of the same things in common with the religious leaders of our day. In Jesus' time, in order to be a minister, you had to go through the temple and this whole process you'd be educated in the temple, you'd be educated by a mentor, that mentor would pass you on, you would go through these rituals, and then you would have the blessing and the authority to act on behalf of God through the church, through the synagogue, through the religious leaders of that day, which meant that they kept a pretty tight control on what the message was. And that's where the problem was. We have the exact same problem today. I started out as a minister in the Assemblies of God, which was a very conservative denomination. It was a denomination that, and when I say denomination, it means just a group of Christians, a particular community that has certain beliefs. In that group that I was a part of, it was very much holiness driven, very purity driven, very much driven by not doing bad things. You know, in our vernacular at that time, it was don't be a sinner, don't do what sinners do, and whatever that meant, right? And in all the other groups of Christianity, for the most part, they have a centralized authority, whoever that general council is, and then all the ministers are essentially blessed through there and are given the opportunity to minister and be pastors of churches from there. And that was the direction that I was going through early in my life, because I wanted to be a minister, and I ended up ministering in some churches. But here's the problem. And this is the problem that Jesus faced 2,000 years ago. What happens when the authority no longer seems to follow the principles of what they stood for at one time? What happens when those who give the blessing and the authority to individuals to stand up and talk about these things, what happens at that point when those leaders no longer bring the message that was intended to be brought to people? In Jesus' time, we've got Pharisees and Sadducees who are perfect at the whole purity thing, right? They're doing all kinds of crazy stuff and praying in public and mourning in public and showing everybody just how perfect they are. Meanwhile, over here, the untouchables, as they would call them, the sick, the lepers, the poor, they were being left completely isolated. There was no help coming to them. What was the intention of the religious leaders at one time? It was to gather the wealth in excess of those who had plenty and to distribute it to those who did not have plenty. That was the intention today of our religious leaders as well. And it was my intention early on to try to do the same thing. But my own particular lifestyle, my own particular experience in my faith led me down a road that wasn't allowed in my group of Christianity. And so I ended up going non-denominational. And now I have just gone to civil human minister, which essentially means that I am stepping outside of religion, of politics, of lifestyle, to talk to human beings, just human beings, to find the common ground that we all share, because we do have more in common than we do in our differences. So today, I want to share with you an encouragement, maybe. There are those of you who may think that you maybe can't stand up and say something to your religious leaders because you lack the authority. You're not ordained or licensed as a minister. None of that matters. What matters are the principles that are important to humanity. What matters is that we have compassion. These key things that Jesus stood for, that the religious leaders of his day completely neglected: compassion, mercy, humility. We can demand those of our leaders today, right here and right now. We don't need to have a license or an ordination from an organization. We don't even need to have a degree. We can stand on a corner or in our social media and bring attention to those who are suffering, to bring compassion to those who are hurting. And not only that, we can actually go into their lives and make a change somehow. I really appreciate your participation in this Bible study. I started this as a result of COVID, right? We were all locked in our houses, and I'm like, I'm going to use the time to revisit my own spirituality, but not as a Christian, as a human being. And that has uncovered some incredible lessons that even as a Christian and even as a minister in that, I completely did not see, that I overlooked. Some of the most simple teachings that Jesus actually gives are gone. They're not even represented in our churches anymore. I would encourage you, as I'm doing that now, to find those ways that we can participate in society. We do not have to be Christians in order to do what Jesus teaches, because what he teaches are good things: compassion, humility, mercy, peacemaking. These are good human qualities, and we can follow them without having to subscribe to a church doctrine or without having to have a membership. Thank you again for joining me. That's our weekend coming up. I hope you have some time this weekend to just relax and maybe spend some time thinking about, what you're doing in life and where you can maybe make some changes to incorporate some of these values, being more compassionate. In this case and in this study, not fearing the need to stand up and talk about things, but just do what you're called to do, what you feel compelled to talk about. And until Monday, when we see each other again, I do want you to know that I love you. I really hope you choose to love yourself. It's the only love in this world we have any control over. And now I invite you to join me for the rest of the day and the rest of the weekend to love our neighbors the same way. Thank you.